muted. If you can be sure to mute, then we won't have any interference with Dr. Russell's presentation. Pamela, you are unmuted, so is there anything you wanted to add before we get started?
I'm just trying to find Dr. Russell.
Oh, I saw him. He's somewhere. He's there. I saw him wave his hand.
Okay.
And then
find him so I can pin him. Go on.
He's waving. And then finally, I just want to acknowledge that this program is part of a series that CULCON has been sponsoring, focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, with funding from the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. And we're grateful for that supplementary funding from CULCON to make this possible. So if you want to have a replay, or if you know someone who might also benefit from the conversation or find it interesting, please do let them know. They can find the link at a later date on our website. So I am not going to take any more time except to welcome all of you, thank our longtime friends and supporters, our CULCON panelists, who I see have joined us, for being with us this morning and this evening. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. John Russell, who is the Emeritus Professor of Area Studies at Gifu University. So John, the mic is yours. The presentation will be about 25 minutes, and we'll make sure to allow time for some of your questions. I'll be asking for you to use the raise hand feature, just so that we can manage the conversation most efficiently. So with that, John, thank you so much for your patience, for joining us late in the evening in Japan.
Okay. Thank you, Paige. I want to thank Paige Cottingham Streeter and Pamela Fields for inviting me to speak with you today on this topic. And to say it's an honor and a privilege to meet with all of you online to talk about the intersections between Black and Japanese lives. I want to begin, and I hope hopefully you'll be able to see my PowerPoint. Can everyone see? Okay, I hope you can.
No, not yet.
Okay. I guess, let's see.
Yes.
Can everyone see? Okay.
Yeah.
I want to begin today's talk with two quotations. One is from the anthropologist, the Japanese anthropologist Hiroshi Wagasuma, and the other one is from former U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Edwin O. Reichauer, which I think kind of sum up how the engagement of Africans and Japanese, African Americans and Japanese, have been regarded. Wagasuma and Reichauer's observations are only partially correct, however. There is more to this history of Afro-Asian or Afro-Japanese engagement. The intersection of Black and Japanese lives has a long history of both triumph and tribulation, one that has generally been overlooked on both sides of the Pacific. When the issue of Black and Japanese engagement is raised, it is almost always in the context of anti-Black racism. Most notably, this was the case during the mid-1980s and early 1990s, the heyday of U.S. Japan trade friction, when a trioca of Japanese politicians, intoxicated over Japan's economic success, uttered racist remarks that blamed Black people for what they perceived as America's decline. This prompted responses from American corporations and civic groups that criticized Japan and touted the strengths of American diversity. Demonstrations also took place in Japan. In 1990, following racist remarks by the Japanese Minister of Justice, a coalition of Blacks, ethnic Koreans, Burakumin, and majority Japanese organized an anti-racism demonstration in Tokyo. This was not the first time, however, that Blacks and Japanese minorities in Japan joined in solidarity against racism. In the 1970s, Black GIs and local Okinawans united to oppose American racial discrimination in Okinawa. In recent years, in the wake of the global Black Lives Matter movement, media outlets, particularly those overseas, have turned their attention to the circumstances of Black people in Japan, where thousands throughout the nation marched to raise awareness about American anti-Black racism and Japan's own troubled history of racism and discrimination against Blacks and other minorities, a history that includes police brutality and the racial profiling of foreigners. Today, the topic of Blacks in Japan has its own Wikipedia page, although it is a brief one that glosses over the 4.5 centuries of contact between the two groups. And that, with one exception, Yasuke, whom I will discuss in a moment, is confined to a list of Japan-born and foreign-born Black and mixed-race Black Japanese notables from the fields of sports and entertainment. Hollywood has also rekindled interest in Blacks in Japan. In 2019, prior to his untimely death, it was announced that actor Chadwick Boseman of Black Panther fame would star in and produce a film based on the true story of Yasuke, a 16th century African brought to Japan by Jesuit missionaries, who was retained by the warlord Oda Nobunaga. In Japan, the tale of Yasuke has been around for generations, serving as the subject of an award-winning 1968 children's book and a scatological comedic novel that depicts him as a buffoonish, cowardly fish out of water. He has also appeared in manga, television dramas, and video games, though most Japanese are not that familiar with him. Unfortunately, the film version of Yasuke was canceled following Boseman's death. A fantasy-infused animated version, which adds wizards, giant robots, and Russian werewolves to the narrative, was produced by Netflix and released last year, which some of you may have seen. A live-action Netflix series has also been announced. Interest in the historical Yasuke has grown, and several books on his life, both academic and popular, have been published, as well as countless YouTube videos from around the world. Yasuke's story, however, is only one chapter in a century-spanning chronicle of Afro-Japanese engagements that have been characterized by ambivalence on both sides. What remains constant, however, is the question of race and place. Indeed, Japan's first encounter with Black people in the 16th century took place within the context of transplanted racial and power hierarchies, which positioned whites at the top and Blacks as their servants at the bottom, a tableau captured in Japanese folding screens from the period. Nonetheless, early Japanese representations of Black people depicted them as human, little different in physical appearance from their white masters, save hair and skin color. This remained true during the 17th century, as can be seen in this Western-style depiction of an Ethiopian or Abyssinian king posed beside the king of Persia. In some prints, Blacks are depicted sympathetically, as in this 19th century print of enslaved Blacks in Yokohama. This all began to change in 1853 when U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry came to Japan to establish diplomatic and trade relations. Here too, race and place served as subtext in the encounter between Japanese and African Americans. Perry was a master of pomp and circumstance. During his presentation of letters from President Millard Fillmore to the Emperor of Japan, he was flanked by two imposing Black stewards, one of whom is pictured here, who served as his bodyguard, a perfect display of American power that was intended to intimidate his Japanese hosts. For if Perry, who had sailed to Japan with a squadron of impressive, heavily armed gunboats, could control these Black giants, imagine his hosts may have wondered what that power could do if exerted against Japanese. When Perry returned to Japan in 1854, upon successfully concluding a treaty of commerce with Japan, he treated his hosts to a minstrel show or Ethiopian concert. However, these Ethiopians were a far cry from the Ethiopian king we encountered a couple of slides ago, as they were performed by white members of Perry's crew in blackface. These minstrel performances would leave an indelible impression on Japanese. By the 1870s, Japanese blackface and other Western caricatures would emerge and stamp their distorted visage on virtually every aspect of Japanese popular culture well into the 21st century. These images eclipse the human face of Afro-Japanese encounters. In fact, Japan's first encounter with African Americans did not begin with Perry. That distinction belongs to Pyrrhus Conser. In 1845, some 8 years before Perry's arrival, Conser, a former slave, was serving as helmsman aboard an American whaler, the Manhattan, when it rescued Japanese sailors shipwrecked in the Bonin Islands and returned them safely to Japan. When Japan's first embassy visited the U.S. in 1860, once again, the ballet of race and place took center stage. White elites celebrated these foreign dignitaries, wining and dining them wherever they went. White journalists who covered them described some members as white or, quote, almost Caucasian in complexion, end quote. However, the African-American press saw them as, quote, colored men of the East and Negroes from Japan. Frederick Douglass lamented that the white crowds that gathered to see them referred to them by the N-word. While African-American views of the Japanese were sympathetic, the same could not be said of the embassy's views of Blacks, who were described by one member as, quote, inferior human beings and extremely stupid, end of quote. In contrast, African-American reaction to the delegation was ambivalent, wavering between feelings of solidarity with Japanese as fellow people of color and resentment towards them because they received special treatment and were not inclined to associate with Blacks, preferring instead the company of their white host and the privileges that afforded. Just as Perry's arrival in Japan impacted Japan's popular culture, the Japanese embassy left its own imprint on American popular culture. On the stage, the diminutive Black minstrel actor Thomas Dilworth, or Japanese Tommy, as he was called, impersonated Japanese. His stage name was derived from the nickname Americans had given the embassy's youngest and most popular member, who appears on the left here. In 1871, Japan dispatched another embassy to America and Europe. Arriving in America during the Reconstruction era, this new delegation expressed a more enlightened view of Black people than its predecessor. Although its members still viewed themselves and whites as superior, they were inspired by the efforts of formerly enslaved Blacks to improve their lives and position through education and hard work, and saw in them a reflection of their own racial uplift ambitions. If Reconstruction impacted Japanese views of Blacks and of themselves in the 19th century, during the 20th, Japan's victory over the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 had a similar impact on African-American views of Japanese, with Japanese now admired for successfully challenging the myth of white supremacy. NAACP co-founder W.E.B. Du Bois, a Japanophile born in 1868, the start of the reign of the Emperor Meiji, saw in Japan's victory triumph over Western imperialism that, in his words, quote, broke the foolish modern magic of the word white, end quote. Like Du Bois, many Black elites expressed solidarity with Japanese. Others were less certain Japanese shared these feelings. In 1919, a delegation of Black internationalists, including A. Philip Randolph and Ida B. Wells, visited the Japanese delegation to the Paris Peace Conference in New York in the hope that they could convince them to specifically address the matter of American racism at the conference in Paris. Randolph, echoing Black criticism leveled at the Japanese during the first embassy, noted that as elites, the Japanese delegates in New York enjoyed a position of privilege and, quote, did not suffer from race prejudice, end quote. He was also critical of Japan's imperialist aggressions against Korea and China. The poet Langston Hughes, who visited Japan in 1933, was also less than enamored with Japan. He suggested that pragmatic self-interest was the reason for Japan's reluctance, or for Japanese reluctance, to associate with Blacks in the States, and drew parallels between Japan's treatment of ethnic Koreans and Americans' treatment of Blacks. By the 1920s and 1940s, the generally favorable, if qualified, sense of regard African Americans had for Japan had raised fears within the FBI and the offices of American naval and military intelligence that Blacks were plotting with Japanese agents, armed insurrections against the United States. During World War II, fearing that Japanese propaganda and Black grievance against America would impede Black support for the war effort and lead to a race war, the FBI launched RACON, its survey of racial conditions in the United States. FBI fears aside, African Americans supported the war, even though their hopes for a double victory against the Axis abroad and white supremacy at home were only partially fulfilled. In discussing these neglected crossroads, I would be remiss not to point out the gender bias that has determined whose narratives get told. The history of Afro-Japanese encounters has been one primarily painted as an encounter between men. The intersection of Black and Japanese female lives is rarely discussed. For example, discussion of the occupation has primarily focused on the experiences of Black servicemen, their involvement with Japanese women, and racial conflict between white and Black GIs. However, interactions with Japanese during this period were not, of course, limited to male GIs. While numerically small, Black service women and civilians were stationed in Japan, and on the whole, Japanese treatment towards them, and I should say treated them to a level of courtesy and respect that they did not experience at home. Another neglected area is the contribution Blacks made to Japan's national pastime, baseball. Many accounts of the relationship between US and Japanese baseball omit the contributions African Americans and Japanese Americans made to the sport's development in Japan. For while the 19th century educator Horace Wilson is credited as the father of Japanese baseball, and the contributions of the 1934 Major League All-Star Exhibition Games in Japan is acknowledged, the role of the Negro Leagues, particularly the Philadelphia Royal Giants, who participated in several goodwill tours in Japan between 1927 and 1934, is omitted. Sports historian Kazuo Sayama has called the Negro Leagues the mother of Japanese professional baseball, and described the Royals as gentle Black giants, writing that while white teams played to overwhelm and humiliate their opponents, Black players respected their Japanese hosts. Today, many Afro-Japanese engagements are transacted through social media and on the internet. Social media and the global BLM movement have prompted discussion within Japan about its attitudes towards Black people and its own increasingly visible internal diversity. The global transparency of social media has exposed aspects of the Afro-Japanese experience that were once hidden and opened them up to global discussion and critique. This is particularly true when it comes to Japanese mainstream media's problematic handling of American anti-Black racism. This was the case when public broadcaster NHK aired a tone-deaf program on American BLM protests, which not only included a brief animated segment that depicted Black demonstrators as an angry, looting mob, but a studio discussion that failed to mention the endless string of extrajudicial killings of Blacks by police leading up to the protests. One commentator even suggested that such brutality was, well, justified because police fear for their lives, and blamed white Antifa agitators for the violence. Another broadcaster, TBS, was criticized on social media when it invited Japan-born American white supremacist Jared Taylor to discuss BLM. This growth of social media comes at a time when Japan is coming to acknowledge, if awkwardly and somewhat painfully, the presence of its own increasingly visible minorities, including African Americans, mixed race Japanese, and an expanding population of African immigrants, and to recognize that the Black presence in Japan is not necessarily always a foreign one. In 2015, Ariana Miyamoto was crowned Miss Universe Japan, becoming the first Japanese of mixed racial heritage, African American and Japanese, to represent Japan. 5 years later, in 2020, not only was Harumi Aisha Tochigi, a Ghanaian Japanese, crowned Miss Universe Japan, but Raimu Kaminashi, a Nigerian Japanese, was first runner-up. These achievements reflect two significant societal shifts. First, the Japanese term hafu, or mixed race, which until recently primarily connoted white Japanese, has now expanded to include a spectrum of mixed race individuals, many of whom are of continental African Japanese descent. Second, and relatedly, there has also been a change in the image of Black foreigners from one associated primarily with African Americans to one inclusive of Africans and other persons of African descent. Still, the question remains, what will Japan make of its newly emergent diversity? The response has been a mixed bag. Miyamoto, the tennis ace Naomi Osaka, and other Black Japanese are frequent targets of online racist harassment. And some media and corporations have found it difficult to accommodate their presence. For example, although no racism was intended, a 2019 Nihonjin commercial featured an anime version of Osaka that erased all physical traces of her African heritage. However, this may not be representative of how most Japanese see Osaka. Many artistic netizens had no difficulty producing images of Osaka that resembled her and retained markers of her Blackness. In fact, the internet provides a window through which we can better glimpse the ongoing evolution of Japanese visual representations of Black people. In part, this evolution is the product of the popularity of imported African-American soft power. This reflects not only a change in how Japanese depict Black people, but also in how they have come to see themselves, as some artists, influenced by hip hop and rap, depict Japanese characters as Black in appearance. During the 1990s, the height of Japan's hip hop boom, for some young Japanese identifying with Blacks and Blackness became both a style and a statement. These statements of affiliation continue today in the moment of BLM, though how deeply they run and whether they will be sustained is unclear. What is clear is that the internet and social media have provided a platform to deepen these encounters by facilitating the flow of information both within and among these communities. The oldest, JAFA, the Japan African American Friendship Association, was established in Tokyo in 1981 by African American expatriates and local Japanese. Another organization, Jaspora, founded in 2019, reflects the growth of African communities in Japan. Finally, there is the Black Experience in Japan, a YouTube channel which began producing videos about Black life in Japan in 2017. As of September, it has 323,000 subscribers and has posted several hundred, and I think it's about 500 at this time, interviews with Black residents. Acknowledging these connections and encounters is imperative in a world that has become increasingly fractious, xenophobic, and disdainful of diversity. However, the expansion of social media does not come without caveats. While it has provided new venues for communication and exchange, like the mainstream media before it, it continues to perpetuate stereotypes. This includes websites that repeat disinformation, that builds walls between Black and Asian communities in both countries. One source of disinformation, coming from America, portrays the perpetrators of anti-Asian violence as predominantly Black, a perception that Japanese media, both mainstream and social, regurgitates. What remains clear is that both countries must acknowledge and come to terms with their own diversity and that of the other. One step in accomplishing this is for both countries to explore these neglected crossroads in a way that recognizes what was, what is and what can be. Thank you for listening.
Wow, John, thank you so much. You've walked us through 4 centuries of history in 25, 30 minutes. That's pretty impressive, and how comprehensive. I want to make sure that we do honor the hour that you all have dedicated to us, and so we will conclude on time. I'll remind you that if you want to ask a question, you may use the raise hand feature, and that's found in the reactions button. And I'm going to, because I see my former professor, Tom Havens. Tom, did you mean to raise your hand? I was going to acknowledge you if I do have a couple of questions, but I want to get in as many as possible. So
no, Paige, please go ahead.
okay, all right. That was practice. All right. So let me just simply acknowledge that there's clearly been these 4 centuries of contact between African Americans and Japanese over time, and not just African Americans, but Black people more broadly. And that's one of the points that I thought was interesting about your presentation, John, the fact that the dialogue may initially have started between the U.S. and Japan, and the impact of negative perceptions on the part of Japanese on African Americans. But clearly now the arch has expanded, and we're now looking sort of in a more global context and thinking about the African diaspora wherever we are. So as from the context of CULCON, and we think about educational and cultural exchange, and we think about ways to inform each country about the other and promote understanding, is there an area where there's greater influence? Is it the experience of being together when people meet face to face, or is it through seeing each other through the lens of a third party, whether it's white Americans or whether it's these emissaries, or is it social media? If we were to invest our resources, our time, our dollars to try to make sure that there's accurate knowledge and information about Japanese people in the Black community and Black people in the Japanese community, where do you think would be a worthwhile place to make that investment? Is one type of engagement more influential than the other?
I think they both go hand in hand. I think that, in terms of presenting information, in terms of presenting, background, historical background, that social media plays a big role. But at the same time, there also has to be an opportunity for person-to-person contact. And I can't thinking of one without the other. You can have tons of information that you have learned and studied and absorbed intellectually. But if you don't actually have the experience of meeting someone from another culture, it almost becomes moot. So I think that both really are tremendously important. And that goes on both sides in presenting information to Japanese about the African American community, about the African diaspora. That's important. It's also in the other direction as well. I think both of those directions are very much necessary and needed. So that, again, investing in social media, but also investing in interpersonal exchanges are also, in educational exchanges, I think are very important in dealing with that issue.
Thank you so much. I see Rachel Williams has raised her hand. If you would introduce yourself and ask your brief question, thank you.
Okay, hi, my name is Rachel. I am an African American who is doing graduate work in Japan right now, and I have read lots of Dr. Russell's work that's been very influential in me working on my master's thesis, which is about Black representation in Japanese animation. So my question is related to that. I know that you've been in Japan for a very long time now, and I was wondering about how you've noticed representation change since you've been in Japan.
Okay. I think it's changed in many ways in a lot of areas. I mean, 30 years ago, you would have these basically kind of, caricatures that came out of 1930s America, minstrel images, angry Blacks, athletes. And these images are still here, but they've been modulated over the last 30 years so that you're finding more and more, I won't necessarily say realistic, but less unflattering images of Black people. I think if you look at, for example, I mentioned the Nihonjin commercial with Naomi Osaka. And in the American press, that was described as whitewashing, okay? I think that is kind of a misnomer, because what they were doing with her was basically turning her into a Japanese, the way Japanese depict themselves in anime. Okay, they were erasing her African traits, her features, to kind of assimilate her into an image of that would be acceptable to Japanese. And I see to some extent with what's taking place in anime and in manga now is, again, a movement away from these kind of grotesque, unflattering caricatures towards a more Japanese anime kind of representation of Black characters, as well as, because of the influence of hip hop culture, representations of Black people that are indeed fairly realistic. And you'll see some of that if you look up images on the internet. And the other point that I would make, and I hope it addresses your question though, is that, again, this representation of Black people and how it's changed over the 3 decades or so also applies to how Japanese now are representing themselves. So you will see in Japanese manga characters that are Japanese, but yet judging by their physical appearance and judging by the clothing that they wear, they appear to be Black. And I think that kind of marks a major transition away from the kind of traditional way that Japanese have been depicting themselves in manga basically since the post-war period.
John, may I follow up on that last point a bit? So would it be fair to say that maybe, at least in the manga anime world, there's a recognition of greater diversity in Japan? And I'm asking that question because, we've all, I shouldn't say we've all, but many of us who have been in conversation over the years about Japan, and when we think about, and you referenced it in your presentation, the fact that there are these marginalized populations, but at the same time, it's not always officially recognized, or there isn't, but the Black Lives Matter movement did sort of raise some awareness about that. So I guess I'm just asking, at least in the anime and manga world, is there greater representation of Japan's diversity? And if I may just ask if the Black Lives Matter movement in Japan is an opportunity to raise awareness about those groups, or is it really more of an allyship, a kinship on the part of Japanese society or expats in Japan in support of African-American experience in the United States?
Okay.
So there's 2 questions there.
Right. Let me answer your second question first.
Okay.
I think that, well, one, the Black Lives Matter movement in Japan has, I think, allowed or provided an opportunity for Japanese to really come to terms with diversity within their own society. And that includes, again, not only in terms of African Americans in the States, or in terms of other members of the African diaspora in the States, but also in Japan, and also other minorities in Japan. This kind of goes to social media, but one of the disturbing things that one finds, and I mentioned somewhat the positive aspects of social media. There's a downside, of course, as well. And just as in the United States, you have a lot of hate speech, you have an awful lot of that in Japan. And what's interesting is that, you know, to some extent, the reaction to Black Lives Matter has been positive, but there's also been kind of a backlash. And it's directed not only at Black people and that have raised the issue of discrimination in Japan, but also at other ethnic minorities in Japan, particularly ethnic Koreans. And if you go and if you look at some of the posts that were made about Miyamoto, who was crowned Miss Universe Japan, if you look at some of the reaction to Naomi Osaka when she was wearing the Black Lives Matter mask, they'll begin with a critique of her or them, and then they'll progress into or I shouldn't say progress, regress would probably be a better way of saying it, into an attack on Black people in general. But then also, almost always, these threads turn into an attack on ethnic Koreans, saying that, oh yes, well, she must be ethnic Korean because she's complaining about racism. And you know that Blacks always complain about racism like ethnic Koreans do. So there's that backlash. And I think that the Black Lives Matter movement, in a sense, has kind of brought together different segments of Japanese society that for a long time had been ignored. And I'll give you one more example of that. There was the Nike commercial that dealt with bullying in Japan, okay? That dealt with the experiences that mixed race individuals have, that ethnic Koreans in Japan have, that was heavily criticized in social media because, again, it was seen as you know, painting Japanese society as a whole as racist. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that Black Lives Matter presents an opportunity for these issues of race, not only in terms of Blacks and other members of the African diaspora, but also in terms of the treatment of other minorities in Japan. I would also add that by coincidence, perhaps, before the death of George Floyd was reported in Japan, which I think was May 25th, there had been an incident, and it was in one of the slides, of a Kurdish man who had been roughed up by police. And there were demonstrations for that, which meshed with the demonstrations in support of Black Lives Matter. So again, here you have a sense of recognition that there are problems of race and ethnicity in Japan that have for a long time been kind of brushed under the rug. And because of social media, they're brought to light and they're discussed. So there are plenty of opportunities because of that to build these coalitions across ethnicity, across nation, across all these other kind of borders and boundaries that have artificially been created. I'm trying to remember what your first question was.
The first was whether anime and manga is an acknowledgement that maybe there is a recognition of some diversity in Japan.
I think so. Again, I think there's a lot more that has to be done, but I think that gradually, if you compare the situation to what it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, there has been a change, okay? And again, going back to Naomi Osaka, there's a comic book now, Nakayoshi, I think is the name of it, where she's a prime character. And she and her sister are also advisors on that comic book. And so, again, there is an attempt to better represent, you know, groups that have not been represented before, or at least in a positive light. And I would say that, you know, there's progress that's being made.
Well, thank you for that, John. I know there's so much more that we can share, and maybe we'll have to invite you back but the time has gone by quickly. I apologize for the late start, but John, it's really wonderful to see you again. Thank you for your work. Thank you for raising awareness and shining a light on aspects of history that some of us may not have been aware, and also giving us a sense of that the fact that there is change, and we can all be a part of that change in the varieties of ways that we engage with Japan. So John, Russell, thank you so much for taking the time, for staying up late. And all of you, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, Paige.
Thank
Thank you very much.